Before we begin, I need you to picture something. You are sitting in the third pew of a church. The organ is playing. White roses line every aisle. Your little girl is in the most beautiful dress you've ever put on her. She's 4 years old. She has a tiny flower crown in her curls, and she's been talking about this day for 3 weeks straight, because Auntie Caroline is getting married, and your daughter gets to watch. She's not in the wedding party. She's just your little girl sitting quietly beside you, clutching her stuffed rabbit, whispering, "Mama, is that princess music?" And then it happens. A hand. An adult hand. Reaching across the pew, grabbing your daughter by the back of her hair and yanking hard. Your 4-year-old screams. And the woman holding her hair, my own mother's best friend, the woman who helped plan this entire wedding, drags my child out of that church by the roots of her curls while every single person in attendance watches. And says nothing. Not my mother, not my sister, not the groom, not one single guest in that church stood up. Not one. What happened next? The silence, the betrayal, the paperwork, the patience, and ultimately, the quiet justice that unfolded over the next 14 months, is what I'm about to tell you. Every detail, every document, every moment that made me realize that the most devastating revenge isn't the kind you scream, it's the kind you build, slowly, methodically, with your hands perfectly still and your eyes wide open. Stay with me, because the ending of this story is the part none of them ever saw coming. And before I go any further, please subscribe. Your support means everything, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. If this story finds even one person who needs to hear it, that's enough for me. Hit subscribe right now, and let's get into this together. I'm 35 years old. I live in New York City, have for almost a decade now. I moved here when I was 26, with 2 suitcases, a journalism degree, and a very specific need to put distance between myself and the town I grew up in. Not because I hated home, but because I always knew that if I stayed too close to my family, I would disappear into whatever role they assigned me. I am the middle child. I have an older sister, Caroline, who is 38, and a younger brother, Philip, who is 29. Our mother, Moira, is 62 and still lives in the same 4-bedroom colonial in suburban Connecticut where we all grew up. Our father, Henry, passed when I was 19, and what that loss did to our family is a story for another time. What matters here is that after he died, my mother bonded herself even more tightly to her social circle, specifically to her best friend of 30 years, a woman named Maggie. Maggie. I need you to understand who Maggie is. Maggie is not a villain who lurks in shadows. She is a villain who bakes casseroles and compliments your haircut before twisting the knife. She is the kind of woman who has never once raised her voice in public, but who has, over the course of my entire childhood, whispered the most precise and devastating things into my mother's ear about me. She told my mother I was ungrateful when I went to college out of state. She told my mother I was chasing a fantasy when I got my first byline. She told my mother when I got pregnant at 31 without being married, that she worried about me. She worried about me. Maggie has a daughter named Holly, who is 32, and a son named Alan, who is 36. Holly has always been held up as the standard, the yardstick, the woman my mother wished she had produced. Holly got married at 28, has 2 children, lives 4 minutes from our mother's house, and calls every Sunday morning without fail. I know this because my mother mentions it, often. My daughter's name is Brianna. She'll be 5 in October. Her father, a man named Dante, and I were together for 4 years and have been co-parenting Brianna with tremendous respect and love for 3 years since our split. Dante is a good man, one of the best I've known. But our relationship was not built to last a lifetime, and we were both honest enough to admit it. Brianna knows she is loved by both of us completely, and for a 4-year-old, she is remarkably secure in that love. She was secure enough, in fact, to be absolutely thrilled about Auntie Caroline's wedding. Caroline and I have never been close in the way sisters are on television. We don't finish each other's sentences or call each other crying at midnight, but we have always been, I thought, respectful, civil, occasionally warm. When she called me to say she was engaged to a man named Francis, I sent flowers. When she asked me to attend the wedding, I said yes without hesitation. When she did not ask me to be in the wedding party, choosing instead Holly and 2 other friends, I said nothing. I was not wounded, it was her day. I simply bought a beautiful sage green dress, found Brianna the most perfect white eyelet frock with a satin sash, and I got on the train to Connecticut. I had no idea what was waiting for us. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon in June. Brianna and I arrived at the church at 1:30. I had her hair done in 2 little puffs with pearl clips. She had her stuffed rabbit, his name is Biscuit, tucked under her arm. She was wearing white satin Mary Janes and she kept looking down at them and saying, "I'm sparkly, Mama." I took 17 photos of her on the church steps. Inside, the church was full, maybe 200 guests. My mother was already seated near the front, in the second pew on the bride's side, flanked by Maggie on her left. I should have taken the seating as information. In my family, proximity to the front is a hierarchy, and I had not been told where to sit. There was no reserved pew for me. No usher came to lead me forward. I found a seat in the third row, 2 pews behind my mother. I could see the back of her head, silver blonde hair pinned in a chignon. I could see Maggie's profile. Maggie turned around once, saw me, and her face did something complicated that I did not pause to interpret. I really should have. Brianna sat next to me and held my hand and watched the flower girls come down the aisle with enormous solemn eyes. She leaned up to my ear and whispered, "Can I be a flower girl someday, Mama?" I told her yes, baby, someday. She settled back against the pew with Biscuit in her lap and was, I want to be absolutely clear about this, completely silent and still. The ceremony began. The officiant, a pastor named Reverend Johnson, opened with a reading. Caroline appeared at the back of the church on the arm of Uncle Timothy, our father's brother, since our father is gone. She was breathtaking in ivory lace. Francis stood at the altar with his best man, Sean, and when he saw Caroline, his eyes filled with tears. It was truly a beautiful moment. And then Brianna sneezed. One small sneeze. The kind of sneeze a 4-year-old has at the exact wrong moment in a quiet space. I immediately leaned down to her, whispered "bless you," handed her a tissue. She whispered, "Thank you, Mama," back to me. 3 seconds, maybe 4. That's when the hand came. I felt it before I saw it. A sharp, sudden movement beside me. A gasp from my daughter that turned immediately into a shriek. I turned and I saw Maggie, leaning across the pew from behind us, her fingers twisted into the back of Brianna's hair, pulling. Not touching, not tapping, pulling. Brianna's head snapped back. She dropped Biscuit. She screamed, the kind of scream that fills an entire church, the kind of scream that does not belong anywhere near wedding music. I was on my feet in an instant. I said loudly, "Get your hands off my daughter." Maggie let go, but she was already standing, already moving toward the aisle. And she put her hand on Brianna's shoulder, my screaming, terrified 4-year-old's shoulder, and she pushed her firmly out of the pew and toward the back of the church, and she said, in this low, hissing voice, "You should not have brought this child here, you both need to leave." I will not describe to you exactly what I said to Maggie in that church aisle, because some of it is not appropriate for this video. What I will tell you is that I said it at full volume. And I will tell you what happened next, which is the part that broke something in me that I am still, 14 months later, in the process of repairing. My mother turned around. She looked at me. She looked at Brianna, who was crying against my leg. She looked at Maggie. And then she turned back to face the altar. That's it. That is all she did. Caroline, from her position halfway down the aisle, paused for just a moment. Francis reached for her hand. She took it, and they continued walking toward the altar. Not one person came to us, not Uncle Timothy, not Caroline's friend Jane, who I had always liked, not Philip, who was seated 3 rows back, and who made direct eye contact with me for a long, terrible second before he looked away. I picked up Biscuit from the floor. I gathered my daughter in my arms. I walked out of that church. And I sat on the stone steps outside in the June heat with Brianna in my lap for the next 40 minutes while my sister got married inside. I did not go to the reception. Here's what I did instead. I took Brianna to the hotel, ordered her chicken fingers and apple juice from room service, and I sat at the desk with my laptop open and I started writing. Not a letter, not a rant. I started documenting. Time, date, location. What happened, what was said, what I witnessed, who was present. I wrote it all down as though I were filing a police report, which, I want you to know, I was considering. I texted my mother 3 words, "Call me, please." She did not. I texted Caroline, "I hope your day was everything you wanted. I need to speak with you when you're back from your honeymoon." She read it and did not respond. I called Philip. He picked up on the 4th ring and the first thing he said was, "Elena, you kind of made a scene." I hung up. That night, after Brianna was asleep in the hotel bed, I sat in the dark and I made a decision. I have been a journalist for 11 years. I know what documentation looks like. I know what a paper trail is. I know that the loudest reaction is rarely the most effective one. I had spent my whole life reacting loudly to my family, to Maggie's whisper campaigns, to my mother's comparisons, to the 1,000 tiny diminishments that had accumulated over 3 decades into this moment, right here where a grown woman put her hands on my child in a house of God, and nobody said a word. I was done reacting. I was going to act. As this is the part of the story where everything changes, and I need you to still be here with me when we get to the end, because the ending is the part that kept me going through all of it. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means everything, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. SRN. 2 weeks passed before I heard from anyone in my family. In that 2 weeks, I consulted with a family law attorney in New York named Brad, who I want to say up front is a friend of a friend and not someone I am promoting. I told Brad what happened. I described it in writing, my documented account from that night in the hotel. I asked him what my options were. He told me that in the state of Connecticut, what Maggie did, grabbing a child by the hair and physically removing them from a location, could potentially meet the threshold for an assault charge on a minor or, at the very minimum, a civil harassment filing, depending on how the incident was characterized and whether there were witnesses willing to corroborate. He also told me that my most immediate step should be sending a formal cease and desist letter to Maggie, and a separate formal letter to my mother and Caroline, outlining the incident in clear terms and requesting a formal apology. I want to pause here because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Elena, why would you send a formal letter to your own mother? Here is why. Because I have learned in 35 years that emotional conversations with my mother go nowhere. She deflects, she cries, she calls Maggie. And then Maggie reframes whatever I said into something that makes me the villain. A formal letter is different. A formal letter exists. A formal letter cannot be misremembered, reinterpreted, or denied. A formal letter with a signature and a date is a document, and documents, unlike conversations, don't disappear. Brad helped me draft all 3 letters. The letter to Maggie was the most specific. It described the physical contact, the distress caused to my minor child, and stated explicitly that any further contact between Maggie and my daughter would result in a civil complaint. The letter to my mother and Caroline was more measured. It outlined the incident, described my hurt and Brianna's trauma, requested a formal written apology, and stated clearly that until that apology was received, I would not be bringing Brianna to any family gatherings at which Maggie was present. I sent all 3 letters via certified mail. And then I waited. Maggie did not respond. Her husband, a man named Brad, not my Brad, I'll call him Brad H., called my mother and reportedly told her that Maggie was devastated and felt terribly misunderstood. This information reached me through Philip, who had apparently decided he was going to be Switzerland in this conflict, but still couldn't help texting me the play-by-play. My mother's response arrived 17 days after I sent the letter. It was handwritten, 3 pages, and I'm going to summarize it for you because reading it in full would consume this entire video. The gist was this. She was sorry I felt hurt. She wished the wedding day had gone differently. She felt that Maggie had been trying to help manage a difficult situation. She hoped that I would find it in my heart to move forward. She said she loved Brianna and she loved me. She signed it, "Love, Mom." Nowhere in those 3 pages did she say, "What was done to my granddaughter was wrong." Nowhere did she say, I should have stood up. Nowhere did she say, I am sorry. She said she was sorry I felt hurt. And if you have ever been in a relationship, romantic, familial, professional, any kind, with someone who confuses I'm sorry you feel that way with an actual apology, then you know exactly how that letter landed. I filed it. Literally, I put it in a folder, and I kept going. Caroline's response came in the form of a phone call, 3 weeks after the wedding. She called on a Wednesday afternoon, and I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 6 minutes long. I will not paraphrase all of it, but the key moments were, she said she was sorry about what happened. She said Maggie had been out of line. And I want you to notice that she said Maggie was out of line, not that Maggie hurt my child. And then she spent roughly 4.5 of the 6 minutes explaining why she couldn't intervene in the moment, because it was her wedding day, and she couldn't afford the disruption, and she hoped I could understand that, and she loved me. She loved me. I called her back, I let her talk, and then I said calmly, Caroline, I need one thing from you, not an explanation. I need you to say that what Maggie did to Brianna was wrong, that's all. Can you say that? There was a long silence. And then she said, it's just really complicated, Elena. I said, okay, thank you for calling, and I hung up. I went back to my folder. I kept building. What I was building was a boundary structure, not a wall, a structure. Something with architecture, something that could hold weight. I want to explain this carefully, because the word boundaries gets thrown around a lot, and I think it's often misunderstood. A boundary is not an ultimatum, it's not a punishment, it's not a threat. A boundary is a clear statement of what you will and will not participate in, and crucially, it is accompanied by a defined consequence that you are actually prepared to enforce. My boundaries were as follows. 1. Brianna would not attend any family event at which Maggie was present until Maggie issued a written formal apology for the physical contact. 2. I would not attend any family event individually at which Maggie was present until Maggie issued that same apology. 3. My mother, if she chose to continue a close relationship with Maggie without acknowledging what happened to her granddaughter, would have limited access to Brianna. Not zero access. Limited, supervised, on my terms. 4. I would not engage in any conversation about the wedding incident that was not in writing. Phone calls could be misquoted. Texts and emails could not. I communicated all 4 of these clearly in writing to my mother and to Caroline. I was polite. I was not cold. I told them both that I loved them, that I wanted our family to function, and that I was willing to work toward that. But that the path forward had to begin with accountability, and that accountability had not yet been offered. My mother called me 12 times in the following 2 weeks. I did not answer. I texted her a response each time, kind, measured, consistent, reminding her that I had communicated my position clearly and that I was waiting. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Because here's what nobody tells you about holding a boundary with your mother. Every time she called and I didn't answer, I cried. Every single time. Because I am not a cold person, I am not unfeeling. I love my mother, in the complicated and grief-stained way that children of difficult parents learn to love. And every unanswered call felt like a small death. But I kept going, because Brianna was watching me. Even at 4, she was watching me, and she deserved to see her mother stand up. About 6 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I'm glad I did. It was Monet, Francis's older sister who had been at the wedding. I had met her twice, once at an engagement party and once at a brief dinner. She's 34, warm, quietly sharp, the kind of woman who sees everything and stores it without comment until the moment it matters. She said, Elena, I want you to know that I saw everything. I saw what Maggie did to your daughter and I was horrified. I told Francis what I saw, the whole truth of it, because he only had Caroline's version. I thought you should know that you have a witness. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor, I just needed to be lower than I was. I said, Monet, why are you telling me this? She said, because no one else at that table is going to. And because what was done to your little girl was wrong. She said those exact words. What was done to your little girl was wrong. The exact words my own mother and sister could not say. I asked her if she would be willing to write down what she saw, not for legal purposes necessarily, just as a written account. She said yes. 2 days later, I received a detailed time-stamped email from Monet describing what she had witnessed from her position. 3 pews back, the grab, the pull, the scream, my daughter's head snapping backward, my response, and the silence of every adult in that church. I printed it. I put it in the folder. The folder was getting thick. 3 months after the wedding, my mother invited me to Sunday dinner. She said Maggie would not be there. I confirmed this twice in writing before I agreed to come. I left Brianna with Dante for the afternoon and I drove to Connecticut alone. It was me, my mother, Caroline, Francis, and Philip, a family dinner. My mother had made a pot roast, which is the meal she makes when she wants to signal an attempt at normalcy. We sat at the same table I grew up at. I drank 1 glass of wine very slowly, and I watched everyone move around the topic like it was a hot stove. Philip made a joke about the Mets. Caroline talked about their honeymoon in Portugal. Francis, bless him, mentioned that Monet was going to be in New York next month, and asked if I'd be willing to get coffee with her, and Caroline went very still for just a moment before she smiled and said that would be nice. After dinner, while Francis and Philip were doing dishes and Caroline was on her phone, my mother and I sat in the backyard on the same white Adirondack chairs we've sat in my whole life, and she finally said something real. She said, I should have stood up. I didn't respond right away. I waited. She said, in the church, when Brianna cried, I should have turned around. I should have said something. I was afraid of making Caroline's day worse. I was afraid of Maggie. I've been afraid of Maggie for a very long time. Her voice broke on those last words. And that's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in a long time, and I saw someone I hadn't let myself see before. Not the woman who failed me. Not the woman who let her best friend hurt my daughter. I saw a woman who had spent 30 years managing Maggie's emotional volatility at the cost of her own clarity. A woman who had, in a devastating moment, chosen the path of least resistance, and was now sitting in a backyard chair at 62 years old reckoning with what that choice had cost. I said, I know you love Brianna. She nodded. I said, I need you to love her louder than you love your comfort. That's all I'm asking. Just love her louder. My mother cried. I held her hand. We sat there until it was dark. It was not a full reconciliation. It was the beginning of one. And I want to be clear. It was possible only because I had spent 3 months holding the boundary, doing the documentation, refusing to collapse into a screaming match that would have given everyone an excuse to reframe me as the problem. The patience is what made space for that conversation. The paperwork is what made sure I had nothing to be gaslit about. 4 months after the wedding, Maggie made her first mistake. In the absence of any legal or civil action from me, and I want to be honest that this was a calculated choice, not a lack of ability. I wanted to see if accountability would come first. Maggie apparently felt safe. She started showing up at my mother's house again, which she had not done since the letters. She and my mother resumed their Tuesday coffee routine, and at one of those coffees, Maggie said something that my mother repeated to me, not knowing she was handing me exactly what I needed. Maggie told my mother that I was using Brianna as a weapon, that I had invented the severity of what happened, that she had simply touched the child's hair gently to get her attention, and that I had made a scene and fabricated a narrative. My mother told me this, I think, because some part of her wanted me to know that the apology she owed me was being undermined. She told me almost apologetically, like she was warning me. I thanked her, and I went home and added it to the folder, because here's what I now had. I had a written account from a witness that described the physical contact in detail. I had the documented impact. Brianna had 3 sessions with her pediatric therapist in the weeks following the wedding, because she was having nightmares about a woman hurting her hair, and I had the therapy notes. I had my own documented account written the same night, And now I had Maggie, on record through my mother's testimony, publicly characterizing the incident as fabricated. Gaslighting a victim is bad enough. Doing it with a paper trail is a gift. I called Brad, the attorney, and I told him I was ready to move forward. We filed a civil harassment complaint in Connecticut. The process was not fast, it was not dramatic, it involved forms and fees and a significant amount of patience. It involved submitting my documented account, Monet's written account, the therapy notes from Brianna's pediatrician, with all identifying information properly handled, and the certified mail receipts from the original cease and desist letter, which established that Maggie had been formally notified of the harm and had chosen not to respond. The complaint did not result in a courtroom showdown. It resulted in a formal mediation process. Maggie was contacted by the mediator and informed of the filing. Her attorney, yes, she hired one, sent a letter calling the complaint frivolous and retaliatory. Brad responded to that letter with 2 words that I will cherish forever: see exhibit. The exhibits were the witness statement, the therapy notes, the timeline. 3 weeks later, Maggie's attorney reached out and asked if we would be willing to settle the matter without a full hearing, provided that his client was willing to issue a written statement. I said I would consider a written statement, but only if it met specific criteria. It had to be addressed to Brianna by name, it had to acknowledge the physical contact specifically, it had to express that the contact was wrong and caused harm, and it had to be signed. They pushed back on the detail about Brianna. I held the line. On a Tuesday afternoon in September, 14 months after the wedding, I received a letter, addressed to Brianna. It was not warm, it was not tearful, it was, from a legal standpoint, careful and minimal. But it said, the physical contact at the June ceremony was inappropriate and caused harm, and I am sorry. Signed, notarized. I put it in the folder. And then I made a copy, put the copy in an envelope, wrote Brianna's name on it, and put it in her memory box, the box I've been filling since she was born with things I want her to have when she's old enough to understand: her hospital bracelet, a lock of her first haircut, the pearl clips from the wedding morning, a photo of her on the steps of the church, sparkly shoes and all, taken before any of it happened. And now, this letter. So that someday when she is old enough to ask about the scar on that day, she will also have proof that the world responded. My relationship with my mother is not the same as it was. It is, in many ways, better. The honesty that has been forced into the space between us, by the letters, by the boundary holding, by that night in the backyard, has burned away a lot of the performed warmth that used to pass for closeness. What is left is realer, even if it is smaller. She sees Brianna on the first Sunday of every month. She takes her to the Children's Museum in Hartford, which Brianna adores, and she sends me photos. In December, she knitted Brianna a yellow sweater with ducks on it, and Brianna wore it every day for 3 weeks and called it her duck shirt. My mother cried when I told her that. Maggie is no longer in my mother's life in the way she was. I did not ask my mother to end that friendship. I want to be clear about that. I did not deliver an ultimatum. But the process of the complaint, the months of my mother being forced to account for what she knew and what she'd witnessed, and the particular humiliation of watching her best friend hire an attorney rather than simply apologize to a 4-year-old, all of that did something to my mother's loyalty. The Tuesday coffees became occasional, then rare. My mother told me in February that she and Maggie had drifted. She didn't offer more than that. I didn't ask. Caroline and I are still finding our way. She and Frances came to New York in the fall and took Brianna to the Central Park Zoo. We walked together through the penguin exhibit, and she held Brianna's hand and pointed at things and made her laugh, and we were, for that afternoon, something that felt like sisters. We have not yet had the full conversation about what happened and what she should have done. That conversation is waiting. When she is ready, I will be here. Philip and I have spoken more in the last year than in the 5 before it. He told me he was ashamed of looking away in that church, and that he thinks about it more than I probably realize. I told him that acknowledging shame is the first step, and that I was proud of him for saying it out loud. He said, "You sound like a therapist." I said, "I sound like someone who went to therapy." He laughed, and so did I, and it was the most genuine thing we'd shared in years. Dante, Brianna's father, was a rock through all of it. He went with Brianna to her therapy sessions. He documented his own account of Brianna's behavior changes in the weeks after the wedding. He never once weaponized the incident against my family, even when it would have been easy to. He is a good father and a good person, and I am grateful every day for the partnership we have built. And Brianna, my Brianna. She doesn't remember the details. She's 4, almost 5, and the mind at that age is both more fragile and more resilient than we give it credit for. What she remembers, because children remember feelings more than facts, is that something scary happened at a wedding, and then her mama held her and her daddy came, and they got ice cream and watched a movie, and she was safe. She is safe. She told me last week, unprompted, while we were doing a puzzle together, "Mama, you always make things okay." She didn't even look up from the puzzle, she just said it, the way 4-year-olds say things, as though it is simply a fact, as obvious as the sky being blue. I put my hand on her little head, those same curls that someone once grabbed and yanked, and I said, "That's my whole job, baby." She found a puzzle piece and fit it in, and said, "I know." If you've made it to the end of this story, then you know that this was never really about revenge. I know the title says justice, and I believe in what I did. Every letter, every document, every certified mail receipt. I believe in the complaint. I believe in the notarized apology sitting in Brianna's memory box. Those things matter. Not because they made me feel powerful, but because they existed in the world as truth. They could not be unmade. They could not be whispered away. But what I want you to take from this is not how to file a civil complaint. It's the earlier part. It's the hotel room in Connecticut, after everyone had gone to the reception, with Brianna asleep and my laptop open, when I made a decision not to scream, not to spiral, not to burn everything down in one emotional night that would have given everyone around me an excuse to reframe me as unstable. I made a decision to be methodical, to document, to communicate in writing, to hold my boundaries consistently, without cruelty, even when it cost me something. Even when my mother was calling and I was sitting on the floor crying and not answering. Even when Caroline said it's complicated and I wanted to put my fist through the wall. I held. Because the most devastating thing you can do to people who expect you to explode is to simply not explode. To be steady, to be clear, to be documentable. And then, eventually, to be right. Maggie thought I would get loud and go away. She thought the scene in the church, my scene, the one she manufactured by putting her hands in my daughter's hair, would be the thing people remembered. She thought the story would be Elena made a scene at the wedding. Instead, the story is this one. I want to say one more thing before I go, and this is for the person watching this who has been sitting in the third pew their whole life. The person who has spent years being the one who is too much, too loud, too sensitive, too inconvenient. The person whose child has been treated like a footnote in someone else's occasion. You are not the problem. You have never been the problem. Pick up a pen. Open a document. Write down the date, the time, and what happened. Keep going. The system, the actual bureaucratic, paperwork-heavy system, is sometimes slow and sometimes clumsy and sometimes deeply unfair. But it responds to evidence. It responds to consistency. It responds to people who show up again and again with files in their hands and patience in their chest. You are allowed to be patient and angry at the same time. You are allowed to love someone and hold them accountable. You are allowed to want reconciliation and still require it to be earned. Brianna is wearing her duck shirt right now, actually. I can see her from where I'm sitting. She's eating crackers and watching a show about bears, and she doesn't know that this story exists in the world. Someday she will. And I hope she is proud. As this story meant something to you, if it gave you something you needed or reminded you that you are not alone in whatever third pew you've been sitting in, please subscribe. Hit that button right now. Your support means everything, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. Share this with someone who needs it. Leave a comment below and tell me your story, or tell me what part of this hit closest to home. I read every single one. Bauer. I'll see you in the next one.